Zumbaya, 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 Zumbaya. Oh, hello there. Welcome to our next installment of Something Like a Sermon. Today, one of the lectionary texts is Psalm 23. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time there with you today in Psalm 23. And if we know one psalm and all the Psalter, it's probably Psalm 23. It's really familiar, famous psalm, and I trust that we all know a little bit about it. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the entire text here in Psalm 23, but I do want to focus in particular on verse 4 and something that strikes me there in verse 4. Psalm 23, verse 4 says, "Even though I walk through the valley of deep darkness," or your translation might even say, "the valley of the shadow of death. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, no harm, no disaster, no calamity, no danger," that sort of thing. And that's really the message that I want to communicate today. That's what I want to say, that's what I want to talk about, but I'm not going to. And that really is what this confession is all about. I struggle with a verse like Psalm 23, verse 4. In my experience, faith is hard to come by most of the time. And fear and anxiety often win out in many situations in my life. And this is a struggle. This is a challenge for me. This is something I wrestle with on a regular basis. And the great irony is that this is unfortunately bad timing. You might have noticed that over the past month or so, the most popular thing for someone in my position to say is a message that has to do with faith versus fear, or do not fear, or God is in control, all sorts of things. And now more than ever, we have all of us as preachers putting our messages on the internet. I have a ton of friends that are preachers, a lot of Christian friends, and a lot of Christian friends as well that communicate different things on social media. And by and large, you probably have noticed that the most popular message of late has to do with those themes: fear versus faith, and do not fear, and God is in control. And it's like prime time to be a preacher, because that's the message that we're built to give. I mean, this book is full of those sorts of messages. Isn't that the most frequent command in all of Scripture? Do not fear, do not be afraid. I mean, there's no better time to have this message. And trust me, as a preacher, we have an arsenal of those types of messages that we can give. And I'll take everyone at their word. I believe that anyone who is giving that message means it and believes it and knows how to live that out sincerely and authentically. And what I'm confessing today is that I'm jealous of those people. I'm not saying that that I'm in the right. I'm not celebrating the fact that I struggle with fear, with anxiety, and a host of other stuff psychologically that is not part of this video. But I'm not celebrating that fact. What I'm saying is I'm jealous of the people who know how to go through life on a daily basis without struggling with fear, with anxiety. And this isn't a corona talk. This applies now just as much as it applies, just as much as it applied before all of this stuff went down. But obviously, it does have more acute applications during a huge pandemic. So I think I experience it now. I experience it before the coronavirus pandemic. This is just the normal stuff of life. It doesn't have to be about life and death situations, but there are a million different reasons in life to get stressed out, to fear, to be anxious. And there are a million different occasions in life where faith could win out. And I'm saying that those moments are hard to come by for me, and that I often struggle with fear and anxiety. And so when I come across a verse like Psalm 23, verse 4, there are times in my life where I've been able to preach that sincerely, and there are times in my life, like right now, where I absolutely can't. Or I could, but it wouldn't. It would be hypocritical to do so. So this probably isn't super encouraging, but at the very least, I guess I'm trying to be honest. And apparently, this I'm in the huge minority here, where most people apparently don't struggle with this and are totally confident in all sorts of different ways. But maybe there's 1% of people out there that can relate to what I'm saying and maybe feel a little bit intimidated or discouraged by just how many people around us, or so it seems, that that don't wrestle with this stuff, that don't struggle with this, and it seems to be a much easier experience for them. But I want to offer some encouragement to say that if there is anyone else like me who has a hard time saying that stuff and living that stuff out, especially in a time like this, I want to say that you're not the only one, and I struggle with that stuff too. Now, there isn't going to be a happy resolution here. I don't have like some great answer to what we're supposed to do in light of that. But I do have a couple of thoughts, a couple of reflections that I just want to offer. One of those is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And this is a text that comes to mind because here Paul, for very different reasons and on a totally different occasion, ends up saying some words that I think are universally relevant and universally resonate with people who are wrestling with these sorts of issues. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 5, Paul says, rather than boasting about his strengths, says, I'm not going to boast at all, except with regard to my weaknesses. Now, my weaknesses, Paul says, therein lies reason for boasting. And it's interesting why. This is the famous thorn in the flesh text, and lots of interesting discussion and exploration we could do there. But eventually he has this revelation from the Lord in which he hears this message, which says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Power is perfected in weakness. So that Paul eventually comes to this conclusion in verse 10, when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. So I want to offer to you something for reflection. First of all, from this text, what is this strength that Paul has found here in his own weakness? If you're like me and you have a lot of obvious weaknesses, how is it that Paul can come to a position where he says there is something worth boasting about here? What is it that brings him to that conclusion? What is it in this message? My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. What is it about that message that can be true about me and about my own weaknesses? What is that source of strength? So something to reflect on. When I lack faith, when fear and anxiety are winning out, is there yet another type of strength to be found within me, within my very weaknesses. What does that look like? And where does that come from? And the second reflection has to do not with strength and weakness, but about the idea of hope. You might have noticed that faith and fear are not the best of friends in Scripture, but I think there's a slightly better relationship, even if it is a difficult one to describe. A slightly better relationship, a kinship, really, between fear and hope. I think that sometimes those actually can work together. I think we see that in one of the great examples in the way that Mark's gospel ends there in verse 8 about hope and fear somehow being connected. And that's the way that Psalm 23 ends, by the way, as well. Verse 6, surely goodness and faithfulness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the hope of the psalmist here in verse 6. And I find that quite interesting that for all of the enemies and the evil and the fear that's chasing the psalmist throughout Psalm 23, that goodness and faithfulness are also chasing along behind as well in verse 6. And it's the psalmist's hope, and it's my hope, that maybe one day that goodness and that faithfulness would catch up to me, and I could know it and dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I want to end with a little quote, little message that I came across from Miroslav Volf. And this is one that I read just a couple of days ago. And it's about hope. It's about hope and fear and the relationship there. I think you'll find some encouragement in this. Volf says, to live is to hope, and to hope is to expose oneself to fear. Fear for things we love and therefore hope for. If it is true that fear follows hope, then it is also true as long as we fear, all hope is not lost. In fearing, we are still hoping.